Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say hello to everybody who is joining us in person here at UW-SP, and also say thank you to those of you who are joining us via Zoom. You're here for our seminar series, excuse me, History, Successes, and Challenges of Natural Resources Decision Making, and we're going to be hosting Representative Katrina Shankland today. So again, I'd like to thank you for joining us. And before we get started, I would just like to just say a few thank yous to the people who have made this possible. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to our director, Scott Hingstrom at the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. He has helped make a lot of this possible, and he is an extension professional. So we often work with the UW Extension to make these things possible as well. So I'd like to say thank you to them. And also thank you to the College of Natural Resources. We always do this in collaboration with the College of Natural Resources every time we host a seminar series. So we'd certainly like to say thank you for their support and for the time that they put into this. And of course, we recognize the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. So before we introduce our speaker, I just wanted to mark a little save the date. This is the second seminar in our seminar series this year. Our next one is going to be coming up on March 16th. And we're going to be having Tony Blattler, and he is the chair of the Wisconsin Conservation Congress. So all of our speakers are from different levels of decision making in the Wisconsin government, and when it comes to natural resources decision making. So like I said, next week we have Tony Blattler. The week after that, we'll be featuring our Dean Emerita, Christine Thomas. And then we also have some other exciting people coming as well. So please take note of these dates, and these will be both in person and live streamed via our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'd like to take the time to invite our Dean, Brian Sloss, Dean of the College of Natural Resources, and he's going to be introducing our speaker today.
And before I get started, I'd like to thank Jennifer. She always stands up here and thanks everybody else for all the hard work they put into the colloquium, and it's a lot of hard work on her part to get this done. It is my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, State Assembly Representative Katrina Shankland. Representative Shankland has represented our district in the State Assembly since 2012. Throughout her legislative career, she has been a passionate advocate on the environment and our natural resources, consistently insisting on science-based decision-making and increasing environmental literacy of her constituency and our state. Thus, she is an ideal speaker on the role of the legislature in natural resource decision-making. She currently serves on the Assembly Committee on Agriculture, Committee on the Environment, Committee on Sporting Heritage, and she is also a member of the committees on colleges and universities and workforce development. All of these committee assignments are directly relevant and influence the natural resource legislative process, and it impacts our local, regional, and state communities. Further, she was just recently named by Governor Evers to the Wisconsin Council on Forestry. So as you can tell, Representative Shankland really is the go-to for where we need to talk about today in terms of legislative processes. She's been recognized by numerous organizations for her tireless leadership, and I know she'll probably be embarrassed if I run through the whole list, so I'll stop here. But it's a pretty impressive list in terms of Conservation Legislator of the Year, leadership acumen, and all sorts of recognitions by the who's who of our environmental and natural resources fields. Rest assured, if you've ever been in one of our listening sessions or brainstorming efforts, you've been impressed and proud that Representative Shankland represents our district, our university, our college, and our shared environmental and conservation ethic. Representative Shankland, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity. UW-Stevens Point means a lot to me as a person and as a legislator, and I'm so proud to represent them in the State Assembly. So thank you for hosting this series and for bringing us all together to talk about natural resources policymaking. This is something that is not only a passion of mine, but I know is really important to the people of Portage County and Central Wisconsin, and UW-Stevens Point is a statewide and national leader in natural resources. So I'm really honored to participate in this today. So I'm going to be speaking about water policy in Wisconsin, specifically assessing some of the challenges and opportunities over the last 2 biennia, so the last 4 years, in the Wisconsin State Legislature. And I'm going to be speaking specifically about water quality policy through the lens of not only the legislative task force that we had last summer, but also some of the work we've done since then. And I see that future talks and seminars will also host from the DNR and Natural Resources Board, which is great. Some of the stuff I will be touching on today is directly related to their work too. And I really think that's the point. Natural resources, public policy is incredibly interconnected. And so the folks at UW-SP, people at throughout UW system and the Freshwater Collaborative, people within the legislature, within the DNR, people who serve on the Natural Resources Board and the Forestry Council, and within industries and professions outside of government, all play a very clear role in determining our future, and not only our future as it relates to access to clean water, but so many other things as well, such as a healthy and stable climate and public health as it relates to the environment. So Brian did a great job introducing me, so I'm not even going to go through this, but I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm honored to serve the people of the 71st Assembly District. Just one quick note. I did recently graduate from UW-SP, and I'm now a UW-SP alumna and took courses in the CNR. Was really grateful to learn from folks there and always appreciate UW-SP. So I want to do just a very brief Civics 101 refresher course for people who haven't thought about the legislature in a while. So there are two houses in the Wisconsin State Legislature. We have the State Assembly and the State Senate. The State Assembly has 99 assembly districts, so we are certainly around your house. We tend to be a little more, things can be a little more chaotic in the Assembly on some days because there's 99 of us. And the State Senate has 33 Senate districts, and every person in Wisconsin is represented by one person from the Assembly, a state representative, one person from the Senate, a state senator. So the legislature's primary role is to enact laws. We have to pass biennial state budget. Biennial means every 2 years. So we do that every 2 years. And we can also propose constitutional amendments. We interact heavily and frequently with the executive branch. And so the governor, for example, proposes every 2 years the biennial budget. And then ultimately, once the legislature approves it, either signs it, vetoes it, or partially vetoes the state budget. So we interact with him frequently. The governor can call special sessions and introduce special session bills, which he has a lot recently. And so he can bring us in if we choose to follow the special session call, and we can enact legislation or disapprove of legislation he brings forward. The governor appoints cabinet secretaries, and the Senate confirms those appointees as well as other executive appointments. And state agencies, who the governor has oversight over, also propose and revise administrative rules, and the legislature then can reject them once the governor approves them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersection between administrative rules and the legislature. It's not something I would have ever thought I wanted to discuss 5 years ago, but recently there's been a lot of legislation passed over the last few years that have really changed the role of the legislature and its oversight as it relates to the executive branch. So I do want to dig into that a little bit. And then in addition, legislators frequently interact with cabinet secretaries, legislative liaisons to state agencies, and other agency staff. So when we have questions from our constituents about an issue related to a road, we may call the DOT, for example. And so I am in frequent contact, especially with the DNR, sometimes almost weekly, and really enjoy the opportunity to work closely with them and ask for information as well as advocate. So let's move on real quickly, just so you have an idea of what the legislature looks like. We operate on a biennium every 2 years. And so the first year is the odd year. In January 2021 is when we all were inaugurated. And from January or February really to June is when we are focusing heavily on the biennial state budget and passing that in addition to other bills. The next really section of the heavy portion of the legislative session is from typically the fall after the budget passes until right about now. March, and the Senate, I think, has at least to meet one more time, and the Assembly may meet as well. But this is where we're heading towards the end of session right now. And so it is a mad dash to get bills across the finish line. So from this time in the even year, March or April, until November, that is not only campaign season for re-election or who are running again, but also we have nonpartisan legislative study council or legislative council study committees where we can dig into an issue much deeper than usual and work with citizen advocates and experts to really delve in. And that's an opportunity that I encourage people to participate in if they have an expertise in something to the committee. And then it goes back to the new biennium again. So January 2023 will be the next one, just so you have an idea of where we are in the session. What's the role of a legislator as it relates to public policy? I think most people know legislators write bills, they introduce them, and they try to make them become law. But it's also so much more than that, depending on what the individual legislator believes and has a capacity for, and how active their district and their constituencies are. And so I take a very active role in public policy making, and I believe strongly that we should be advancing as many bills as we can related to the subject matter that most interests and affect our constituents. So drafting and introducing legislation is a big part of the job, but so is committee work. And so, for example, I serve on the Environment Committee and the Sport and Heritage Committee. When you go to those committees, you are hearing a number of bills, every committee hearing, and you're hearing directly from citizen input, you're hearing from organizations, you're hearing from state agencies, you might be hearing from subject matter experts, you're hearing from nonpartisan attorneys who advise us, called legislative counsel, and we make decisions after those public hearings in what's called an executive session, when we vote in those committees on the bills, or we can introduce amendments and decide whether or not the bill will advance through committee. We also have legislative floor sessions, which most people are most familiar with when it comes to the legislature. Those are the days where we have anywhere from a few dozen to 50 bills up on the floor, and we will be debating and voting on them. You can also introduce amendments on the floor. You can move to refer bills back to committee or object to a third reading, to a delay of vote. But for the most part, legislative floor sessions are the most substantive action that the legislature takes. In addition, it's just important to mention, we have to pass the bill not only through the Assembly, but the Senate, and then have the governor sign it to get it signed into law. So just a very brief Civics 101. So here's something that's not talked about too often, unless you are within a state agency or directly interacting with them every day. Administrative rules. So administrative rules are initiated by a state agency, really meant to implement our state statutes. State statutes are the bills that are signed into law, the bills that were enacted by the legislature. So for example, there are administrative rules to keep PFAS out of groundwater, drinking water, and surface water. And I'm going to talk about that later. Administrative rules are not state statutes. They're rules to enact the state statutes that tend to be a little more substantive, but they do have the full force of law. And it's important to note that this is typically a 31-month process to create a permanent rule, and it has 35 steps. And there are multiple opportunities throughout the process where members of the public, as well as subject matter experts, can weigh in, including at public hearings. So this is something that isn't talked about a lot, or it isn't reported on heavily in the news until towards the end of the process, where the legislature tends to get involved or another tends to get involved. So I wanted to mention that. The legislative review piece is really important because over the last decade, the legislature has passed laws to really heavily enhance the role of the legislature in this process. So the first thing that happens, the state does a report to the legislature. Rule is then referred to a standing committee. The standing committee has 30 days to review it and can request an additional 30 days. And then there's a special legislative committee called the Joint Committee on Review of Administrative Rules. I've served on it before. It's an interesting place. And what this committee does is it reviews the rule and it listens to testimony if there is any, it listens to citizen feedback if there is any, and then you can object to the rule in whole, in part, or just review. And over the last few years, I have seen this committee reject more rules than before. So it's definitely been used for, and I think that has to do with the additional legislative oversight that has been added. So after that 30-day review period, that's when the rule goes into effect that following month on the first day. So just wanted to mention that just so that we have that background for the rest of what I'm going to talk about today. And I should mention that at the end, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. So I think in addition to proposing legislation, collecting community input and honoring that is just as important, right? No legislator wants to introduce bills that only they care about. No legislator wants to introduce bills that are counter to the interests and needs of their community and their district, right? So I think that's important, and so is being a vocal opponent of legislation that can cause active harm or even passive harm to constituents, to the district, as well as being proactive in trying to solve those problems instead of just saying no or complaining, but saying, hey, why don't I work with you on an amendment? If this is going to pass, let's fix the problem, right? And so I think that's a key part of policymaking in the legislature that I think is important. Here's just a brief list of some of the bills that I have worked on just this session, meaning 2021 and 2022. Some of these bills have passed one house, and some of them have passed one committee, and others are still up for debate if committee chairs want to hear them. So whether it's tackling chronic wasting disease, working on the use of polystyrene and other single-use containers like plastic, or water quality, which I'll be focusing much more on. I try to introduce a number of bills specifically focused on enhancing public health, protecting our environment, ensuring we have ample access to public lands, and ensuring the health and safety of our wildlife in addition to human health. And then just building a better future for everybody. So that's what some of these bills do, and always happy to work on environmental issues in the legislature. All right, so I'm going to talk about the for clean water, and I have to say, it was very hard to narrow down what topics I wanted to talk about because there's so many and I could speak for hours on this. But real quickly, we're going to do 2 biennia, 4 years, so 2 legislative sessions. And just to kind of provide some insight into why this is important. We are proud in Wisconsin that we have more than 15,000 lakes. We have 88,000 miles of rivers and streams. We have more than 5 million acres of wetlands. I haven't even mentioned the Great Lakes. Our state is covered by water. Over 15% of our state is covered by water. Now, where do people get their water from? This is important. Roughly 1/3 of people in Wisconsin get their drinking water from surface water, and about 2/3 of people in Wisconsin get their drinking water from groundwater. Groundwater is also one of our more important sources of water for irrigation. And then, did you know that Wisconsin has more public drinking water systems than anywhere in the country? And the Safe Drinking Water Act requires that public water have to regularly test for contaminants and then take action if the levels are too high. So the DNR is who regulates these public water systems. They make sure they're following the standards. But here's where it gets tricky. If you have a private well, that's not part of a public water system. So even though we have the most public drinking water systems in the nation, we also have 800,000 people in Wisconsin who rely on private wells for their. Unlike municipal water supplies, these are not regulated. The DNR doesn't regulate these. So people who get their drinking water from private wells are responsible for their own well testing and treatment options. That being said, both the DNR and the Department of Health Services, also known as DHS, do a great job providing support and education to community members who do have issues. And I will also say the Center for Watershed Science and Education at UW-Stevens Point also does an incredible job of providing that support. So please call them if you have questions and need more information. But I want to mention that because I think this context is important. People with private wells should really test their wells regularly, at least once a year. And because people and communities are doing great work in testing their wells more regularly and working with the entities mentioned, we are starting to get a better idea of some of our water quality challenges in Wisconsin. So nitrate is the most widespread contaminant. That's what I'm going to be focusing on the most today, just because it's so common. It's very prevalent in Portage County. Significant for infants in terms of causing birth defects and chronic diseases in adults, according to the Department of Health Services. And the primary way in which nitrate can enter groundwater, which we know can also be people's drinking, through fertilizer, mainly agricultural and sometimes residential and septic. Secondly, bacteria is another common contaminant for drinking water in Wisconsin, and it most commonly occurs when there's something that either a septic system is failing, or there's a crack, or it's improperly constructed. There can be like an agricultural practice that led to manure runoff or groundwater infiltration, and then sometimes flooding. So this happens as well, and sometimes you can have both nitrate and bacteria contamination. Lead can enter to the drinking supply. I'm sure people have heard a lot about about this recently, and I'll be talking a little bit about lead and federal money later. That happens when pipes that contain lead corrode, and there is no safe level of lead, especially for children. This is a significant human health issue. And so you really have to replace lead laterals in order to reduce exposure. And then finally, I'm going to talk about PFAS. This is a group of man-made chemicals. It's been used since the 1950s. If you have a non-stick pan or raincoat, fast food packaging, these things can or may contain PFAS. And high levels of PFAS may affect or increase the risk of thyroid disease. It can decrease fertility in women. It can increase the risk of serious conditions like high blood pressure, and it could lower infant birth weights based on the research. So these are just some of the contaminants I'm going to discuss, and just understanding why, there are human health concerns with all of these. So here we go, 2 biennia. We're going to start with 2019 and the year of clean drinking water. January 2019, Governor Evers declared it the year of clean drinking water, and he followed it up with executive orders on lead, PFAS, and nitrate. He also included a significant investment of over $100 million to take action on all 3 of these contaminants in his budget. And some of them passed and some of them didn't. In February, that next month, Speaker Voss, the Speaker of the Assembly, created the Speaker's Task Force on Water Quality. And this was bicameral, meaning both the Assembly and Senate participated, as well as bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats. And the first hearing started in March 2019. So as soon as I saw the announcement, I made a call and said, I would like to serve on this task force. I would like to lead it if possible. This is an issue where I represent a district, 1 in 3 folks in some towns and villages, and in some cases, depending on the year, 1 and 2, not their water, have private wells, and that's for people across the state. So we need to work on this together. So I want to give a lot of credit to the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Health Services, and the Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection. They came with us all around the state and testified not only at the first hearing, providing support for us and recommending only what the governor did in the budget, but also providing scientific information and great recommendations. So from March to September, that main part of the biennium, we traveled to 14 locations and heard from hundreds of people and 70 organizations. And we really tried to take a deep dive into the state's water quality challenges, and we discovered that this could take, there's no amount of time that is sufficient for these issues, right? That significant. And so we did our best in those hearings to hear from as many people as we could, and we put together our recommendations just as the state agencies did. And so in January 2020, the second year of the biennium, we delivered a report, introduced some bills, 10 of which were bipartisan, and said we need to do a minimum of $10 million to invest in these initiatives. So I'm going to go through the bills and where they ended up, but first I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we did. In addition to the bills that we introduced, we also recommended creating a long-term funding source like Minnesota's Clean Water Fund, as well as changing federal agriculture subsidies so they no longer disincentivize some conservation practices, and leveraging federal dollars for lead abatement, which is happening. And the task force also acknowledged Governor Evers on several issues, livestock sighting, nitrate, and PFAS, and acknowledged the executive orders and the year of clean drinking water. And so I think part of why this issue has become so much more on the radar of not only legislators, but members of the press, organizations, lobbying groups, members of the public, is because we have this issue for 4 years straight. So in February 2020, the state assembly passed the 10 bipartisan bills unanimously. But in March 2020, most of you may remember, that was when the pandemic came. I shouldn't say came, but started hitting home in Wisconsin, and shutdowns were starting. And the state Senate, unfortunately, did not meet again, even though they were scheduled to meet. So we can't pass bills just through the assembly. We have to get the Senate too. And so those bills died. So this session, individual members of the task force, as well as others, have been working to pick up some of that work and collaborate. And so I'll provide some updates on that. So just real quickly, some of the work that we put out in 2020, and then I'll provide updates. So we provided funding for county conservation staff. These people are the boots on the ground in every county in the state to protect our water and support conservation practices. This is like nutrient management plans, grazing, you name it, minimizing phosphorus. We also suggested creating an Office of Water Policy within the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey to really take deeper dive into water policy in Wisconsin. The Well Compensation Grant Program, I'm going to talk much more about later, but this will help more people access and the cost of their contamination. The Wisconsin Fund for Septic Systems to help families repair their failing septic tanks. The Freshwater Collaborative, which would have invested $2 million, not only in one school or 6 schools in the system, but eventually everywhere where there's water quality capacity, and to really build a water quality workforce across the state. A pilot program to address nitrate contamination. This is a brand new idea where we provide farmers on-site support from UW system scientists, and they work together to reduce their nitrate, reduce their nitrogen loading and nitrate leaching. And if they're going to bend the yield curve by lowering their nitrogen application, they're going to get an and they'd share the research with the legislature and would use that for future policy. I will be mentioning that as well later. PFAS clean sweep. PFAS, as you remember, is an emerging contaminant. And what this does is it is a current clean sweep program to include firefighting foams with PFAS and help get them out of communities. We also had a bill specifically to fund the Center for Watershed Science and Education at UW-SP. I brought the task force to UW-SP to tour it, and then supporting our counties with groundwater testing, mapping, and educational outreach. Because as I said, not everybody tests their well, but if you have a private well, you should be testing it once a year. So helping local governments really get that information out there to folks through education and outreach, as well as actually conducting the testing. This is an interesting one that we heard, and so wanted to include the prohibition on sale or use of coal-based and PAH sealant products, which also have significant water quality and health concerns. And then we had a big bill for assistance to farmers for conservation. It included a grazing specialist at DATCAP, a new program to help any farm that wants to apply for a certification watersheds or water stewardship, Alliance for Water Stewardship, to get reimbursed for half the cost because it is significant to get audited. And then a new cover crop insurance program similar to Iowa, where farmers that have cover crops would get $5 back for their insurance. And then also providing additional support for producer-led watershed grants, which really provide farmers the opportunity to work together in a water to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loading. So where are things at? All right, so it's 20. I said we're at the end of session. This article is from February 23rd, 2022. And so really the first thing that happened is the pandemic continued much beyond March 2020. And so there were fewer opportunities for legislators to meet and collaborate in person. And as a result, I would say the efforts to kind of pick things up back where they were, I would say, delayed by months as we were, still working through pandemic policy for the first part of session. But the biggest focus that we had heard from folks on, whether it's the Farmers Union or Clean Wisconsin, or the Dairy Business Association or the Nature Conservancy, they were all saying the same thing. We really need to get something done for nitrate. Nitrate contaminants are so significant across the state, we need to act. And so there are 2 bills, which we're calling the nitrate bills, that really take the majority of the nitrate legislation that we introduced last session. And these have both been moving, thankfully, and I'm hoping we can cross the finish line. So the first bill, Assembly Bill 727, is the funding bill that takes the nitrogen pilot, where you're supporting farmers and reducing their loading. It takes the cover crop insurance rebate and the state hydrologist position. And that passed the Joint Finance Committee, which is its budget committee, unanimously. And it also passed the state assembly unanimously a few days ago. So that's fantastic. Let's hope the Senate acts. They are certainly coming back. So if you like this idea, please call your senator and ask to support it. Next, we have this bill to expand eligibility for the Well Compensation Grant Program. This has existed since the 1980s in Wisconsin, but it is so underutilized because of the stringent rules where you have to have a well that tests above 40 parts per million for nitrate. You have to have livestock that relies on that well for more than 3 months a year. The income limits are significantly, they haven't been updated since the 80s. And there are a few other requirements as well. And so this bill really opens up the program to people who test at 10 parts per million, which is the federal health standard, as well as more families, not just for nitrate, but for bacteria too. This is my 8th try at this bill. And so I'm really hoping we're going to get it there. It did pass the state Senate unanimously in January. The Assembly hasn't taken it up. I'm sure hoping the Assembly takes it up in a week or two, if and when we come back. But that's another one where if you like that bill, I encourage you to contact legislators and ask them to get this bill across the finish line. In addition to that, it also has support for producer-led watershed grant access, and it opens up both river protection grants and lake protection grants to producer-led, farmer-led groups. All right, so what are some of the successes? I mentioned all these bills. I know it's lots, but I want to point out how the legislative process is not linear. And sometimes you get lucky and other times you get unlucky and you just have to keep going. So if you recall, the Freshwater Collaborative Bill, which I was a lead author on, originally only had $2 million appropriated. In this state budget, which was passed and signed into law, Freshwater Collaborative received $5 million. That won't just positively impact UW-Stevens Point, it'll impact other campuses as well, and it'll impact students at the UW system, in addition to folks who want to see enhanced water quality workforce that are tackling Wisconsin's significant water quality challenges. The Well Compensation Grant Program, which I mentioned, has very stringent access criteria, also received an infusion of $2 million. That account has 3.4 million in it right now, but no one can access it, and no one has accessed it since October 2020. So that's why we need to pass that other bill, but I'm glad they put money there. They put their money where their mouth was, and now we have to fix the program to open it up to more people. Secondly, county conservation is funding received a sufficient increase to support another position so that the boots on the ground can protect our water in counties across the state. Producer-led water granting was increased, and the Clean Sweep program, which I believe we originally had as 250,000, was increased to $1 million. And recently the Joint Finance Committee released those dollars just a few weeks back, a month ago. So these are successes that are not talked about. I don't think I saw a single article about them. They just sort of happen quietly. And I should say the Freshwater Collaborative, everybody has been doing incredible work on, but I don't know that realize the $5 million was passed through the budget. So that was an exciting victory when really hard to get the finish line last session. So a couple other things that are still pending. The Wisconsin Fund was also enacted into law, which by the sunset of that program have another 2 years, another biennium, to help families offset the cost of replacing or rehabilitating their septic systems, their private wastewater treatment systems. As we remember, if they fail, that can cause significant nitrate contamination. Next, I introduced a bill with my colleagues to invest more in private well testing, which I mentioned earlier. So that bill is out and significantly bipartisan. And then finally, the 2 nitrate bills, which I had mentioned, one which passed the Senate, one which passed the Assembly. And so the majority of the work that we did through the task force has passed in terms of either getting through the budget or being funded, but there's still work left to do. And that's really important because once you're done with one thing, you should never be done entirely. You should always go back as a legislator and look for opportunities to build on the successes, hear how it works, not only with the program manager and the people who are using the program, but also the audience who, if it's a private well testing bill, are they getting the answers they need, and are they willing to test every year after that? So I think that's important too. This work never done. PFAS rules is another big thing that happened recently. So the legislature has oversight over administrative rules, as I mentioned earlier, and the Natural Resources Board just recently met in February to vote on the DNR's proposed PFAS rules. So the DNR has a process where the Department of Health Services to go through water, drinking standards, groundwater standards, and make sure it is all in alignment with human health, right? The goal is to protect human health. So they read a lot of medical experts, looking at thousands of documents, looking at what other states and countries do, and then they propose a standard. So the DNR proposed 20 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. Those are two of the main PFAS. And after an extensive review, and the NRB passed a surface water rule. They voted to table the groundwater standards. They didn't move a groundwater standard forward. And then what they did is, instead of taking the 20 parts per trillion, they weakened it to 70 parts per trillion. And that's significant because that means that while, you know, it's positive that they recognize we have a PFAS issue, there's a lot more work to do. And there are a lot of people who may be led to believe that there isn't as much of a PFAS issue. If they test at 25 or 30, it's still significant, and they should still be very concerned about it. So significant. And here's the deal. If you look on the right, we are coming to the legislative review phase under phase 6. And so what's going to happen now that the NRB has met is that there will be a report to the legislature. It'll be referred to the standing committees. We have 30 days to meet. We could have an additional, we actually don't have to meet. We can just passively review it. And then an additional 30 days could be requested by a committee. And then the Joint Committee on Review of Administrative Rules can review that rule. They can object to it. They can object to the entire thing. They could just review it. And if they approve it, then it moves forward. Or I should say, if they don't object. And after that, the rule will be published. But I think it's really important to recognize that there's 8 more steps in the process. And if you believe that we should have drinking water standards for PFAS, if you think eventually we need groundwater standards for PFAS, I encourage you to keep in close contact with your legislators. The public just should be weighing in at every opportunity if they care about not only how this might affect you, but it can affect, you know, if you care about fishing, we've found PFAS in fish, in deer livers, you name it. And so it can certainly affect wildlife as well. In addition, there is a bill called the CLEAR Act in the state legislature, and that would actually give the DNR the ability to regulate these standards at 20 parts per trillion as recommended by the Department of Health Services. So I'm a co-sponsor of that bill. Just want to mention that because in addition to reviewing this rule, advanced by the Natural Resources Board, we as a legislature also could just pass a law requiring the DNR to do this. We don't have for those rules, we can just pass our own. So that's another option, and I think we should do it. So moving forward, I mentioned PFAS and lead earlier, and it's really important to recognize the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which also passed recently. This is the single largest investment in water quality that the federal government has ever made, or I should say investment total. It isn't just in water quality, but the water quality investments are massive. So Wisconsin alone will receive $250 million to remove lead service lines that are connected to homes. As you recall, there's no safe lead level. And so we really need to remove those lead laterals and lead service lines. That money is significantly going to help communities across the state. In addition, there's now $600,000 in federal funds available for municipalities to test for PFAS in Wisconsin. So the DNR is actively working now to reach out to all eligible utilities with more information about it. But what I would like to encourage you to do is locally, you can encourage your municipality to leverage that money to test for PFAS. And I think down the road, we'll see additional opportunities to remediate and PFAS lead through this infrastructure bill. So I want to mention that because serving in the legislature and look at all sources, it's important to recognize that in addition to passing bills through the legislature, we can also talk to members of Congress and work with the federal government to money, and we can work with our local communities who also have received federal money and can use the American Rescue Plan Act dollars to act on nitrate and PFAS and lead too, right? So just a few insights about the legislative process. It's almost never linear, right? You can get a textbook and read about how a bill becomes a law, and that's important to have that foundation about what should happen, but the legislature almost never lives up to the normative ideal of how a bill becomes a law and how we should do it. And sometimes that can mean the process is unpredictable. It's usually fast-paced, especially at the end of session, it can be chaotic. It favors a person who is willing and has the opportunity, time, and resources to follow the legislature's every move, and most people don't. And sometimes the legislature doesn't even follow the prescriptive process. There are times when, especially at the end of session, the assembly will take up bills off the Senate message where we never had a public hearing on them, and we'll waive the public hearing. And so when it comes to the legislature, it's important to note that it doesn't always do what it can or should do, and that what people who are watching the legislature can do is encourage their elected representatives on every level of government to use the full power of their office, not only when it comes to working with different levels of government, but also introducing bills, being proactive on working to address situations, asking them to weigh in, putting out a press release, writing a column, providing information to constituents. I think all of that is important. You see something happen in the news, you'll see, wow, like the legislature just got all this money for XYZ. I wonder how that happened. And it actually turned out it was a 10-year process where one or two legislators were just every single session saying the same thing and requesting the same money over again until they get it. And so I think relentless perseverance from the policymaker is important. So is citizen advocacy, having community members weigh in at every turn and being there for every public hearing, while a task that not everyone can afford or has the privilege to do, is also incredibly important to public policy making, because our public policy is only as good as the level of involvement of the public. I truly believe that. So in this case, I've seen significant victories, even though the initial progress that we made in the water quality task force, passing 10 bipartisan bills unanimously through the assembly, which I will say, as somebody who champions natural resources, brought me to tears and made me feel like it was possible to do more, and that it is possible if you work with folks to educate them on the cause of an issue and work together on a menu of solutions, being flexible to find real resources and not only resources, but solutions to those problems is important. And so I believe we wouldn't have made the progress we have through that first but the second one now, where we're still making progress, without the many people who came to our committees to testify. Our committee had around at least 100 people at almost every single hearing, and many people stayed the entire day to hear from the experts who testified and from citizen and local community members who deeply, deeply care. So I want to give major kudos to anybody who was a part of that process, and they made a huge difference. And I'm hopeful that this is the beginning, as long as we have policy, I should say, not only public policy makers, but people who are highly invested in this work continuing to beat that drum. So this is a call to action. Your voice matters, and you can get involved in any way you feel comfortable, but I encourage you. Sometimes I hear from people who say, I need a law degree in order to do this work, in order to run for office, or to testify at a public hearing. And that's just not true. You can do this work and you can weigh in, whether it's an email to your legislators or showing up to a local city council or town or village board meeting and asking if they know what's in their water and asking what they're doing for nitrate or PFAS. You can do this. A great opportunity that's coming up is the Wisconsin Conservation Congress. So every year they have the spring hearings. They're online this year, but I just wanted to remind people that it's coming up next month. And I think the deadline for submitting resolutions is March 11th. So that's a great way to get involved, because legislators, having served on the Sporting Heritage Committee for a while, we do look at the results of those resolutions and the results of how the vote went on those spring hearings. And then I want to mention this. While it can seem that the only place where action might happen sometimes is through the legislature or through Congress, it's also huge. I've seen huge changes happen on local levels in communities who pilot a new idea, like the city of Appleton and pollinators, and all of a sudden everyone's doing no mow May, right? And all of a sudden the legislature has a pollinator package, and it can just take on its own. It can just grow legs and run through the legislature just because of an awesome idea from one city, for example. And so I want people to recognize that the more involved you are on different levels of government, the better. And so don't be afraid to get to know your local elected officials and advocate for natural resources policy on the local level. It isn't just that all politics are local, it's also you some of the greatest changes in the quick way on the local level, and that moves up. That can get through the halls of Congress if you are determined enough. And then finally, just effective advocacy. If you're doing this work, you're reaching out to your legislators, maybe you want to reach out to a deer management committee member, or maybe you're calling the mayor. Just become an expert on an issue. Instead of being stressed out about knowing and following all 80 bills related to the environment, pick one. If you're a forestry major, I want to hear from you on forestry as it relates to the Forestry Council, right? Like, let's talk, but pick your issue, whether it's pollinators or invasive species, and develop relationships, not just with your elected official, but also with staff. And then stay positive when possible. I do think it's important to hold elected officials accountable to your comfort level, but the best way to move people is by having a positive, motivating message, and if you have a personal story, and then sharing some facts about why the issue is important and what kind of difference it might make to you, your family, the local economy, a business, your pastime, your cherished lake, whatever it is, we want to hear that too. So focus your message, keep it simple, keep it understandable. You want the policymaker to remember you. You want them to say, oh, that was Kyle, and he wanted to talk to me about pesticides. And you want them to think about you when they're taking that vote on pesticides 2 years later, right? So think about that when you're crafting your message. And then if you can do in-person meetings, those are probably effective just because they'll put a face to a name and remember you, hopefully. Also, phone and email are just as effective, I would say. If that's all you can do, good, that's great. Form letters and petitions, while they can be significantly helpful when people are showing the level of support for something, they just tend to be the least personal, so they might not be as effective as like an in-person meeting for coffee with an elected official. And then that's another point, bring a group. If you really want them to have your issue stick out, bring a group and organize around that issue. Citizens Climate Lobby is a great example of a group that is highly engaged. They work with 350 on campus as well on climate change and sustainability, and they are relentless in the best use of the word when it comes to frequently communicating all of their elected officials and continuing tasks for public policy related to their subject matter. So keep doing that, and don't be afraid to request a meeting, provide all the information the staff person who's scheduling the meeting needs to know about it. The more information, the better, frankly. And then prepare, bringing handouts, doing your research. Don't be nervous. This is your time. This is your government. And these people work for you, not the other way around. So don't forget it. I think it's important to recognize that you can make a difference. And whether you're studying in the CNR or whether you're studying political science like I did in undergrad, I think it's important to know that everyone has an equal voice in their government by design. So please don't get hung up on the fact that you don't have a law degree, or this is not something that you do every day, or you don't like public speaking, because this is important. And the votes that we take in the legislature, the decisions we choose to make or not make, don't just affect us for the next few years. They affect future generations. And that's who I try to remember and center when I make decisions on natural resources policy and everything. So with that, I am happy to open it up to questions.
Let me unmute myself here. There we go. Thank you very much, Representative Shankland. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. So for those of you that are via Zoom, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will go ahead and read those off. But I'll start out here with the live audience that we have here. Any questions? No? Give it a minute. Okay, got somebody from Zoom here.
All right, so we've got a question here in the chat. Given the high cost of PFAS testing and the lack of affordable technologies to destroy PFAS, how will the current focus on PFAS legislation, affect the amount of resources available to address other non-PFAS water quality issues? And what other legislation is needed to address the full life cycle of PFAS?
That's an incredibly, and I think that's a super insightful question. And I think your point is that this is a very complex issue for which we have just as many questions as we have some answers, right? And we know even just testing a few years ago for, when people had started the testing through the EPA, I think it was 2014, 2015, they were only testing for certain kinds, and that has changed significantly over the last few years. So I think because it's an emerging contaminant, number one, we need to understand information. We're going to be given more information over time and be better equipped to make decisions. The challenge that we have right now is we have not done the sampling needed to fully understand the scope of the problem. So as a policymaker, I recommend first and foremost that we enhance voluntary testing, which, that $600,000 of federal money will help significantly with that. I think secondly, you mentioned the high cost of PFAS. I would say municipal utilities should be working with the DNR to leverage that federal funding. And then secondly, the lack of affordable technologies to destroy PFAS. I think that's where research comes in. We absolutely need to have additional information about PFAS remediation, right? And I should mention, though I'm not an expert on it, I reached out to them because I was so excited to see it. There's a pilot project on myco remediation related to PFAS, working with the Marathon County Waste Department and UW-Stevens Point. And so I would love to see additional investments in that. And the Freshwater Collaborative is really tasked with identifying emerging contaminants and not only building the water quality workforce around it, but also investing in research. And so I'm hoping that some of the research that comes out in the next few years from our UW system campuses specifically relates to PFAS, knowing that it is what we would call in natural resources not only a wicked problem, but that it is going to demand a massive investment beyond what we have available right now. And I'm hoping there will be future funds down the road. Congress did a great job with the infrastructure bill and investing what they did. And, it's all of our jobs to continue speaking with our members of Congress to encourage them to do more when we know more about what the full scope of contamination looks like. And then, so how would that affect legislation and the amount of resources? I will say this, we have probably, it's the highest surplus I've ever seen since I've served in a decade on the state level right now. So we certainly have state level resources that we could marshal. I think the DNR has done an excellent job identifying some proactive things that we could do, not only through their task force report to the legislature, but also through the PFAS. I apologize, I forgot the full term, but they have a task force. It's a coordinating council specifically related to PFAS, including industry leaders. And I do think everyone who has not only a stake in PFAS, but who may be tasked with remediating it has to have a say. So we need to continue those conversations and cross collaboration across not only the industries that are affected and the people who the waste folks who have who are dealing with it as well, but figuring out with scientists and researchers how to remediate and destroy it appropriately, and then working with policymakers to get that money and those resources down the road. So that's a long-winded answer, but an incredibly nuanced question, and I appreciate you asking that. So you had said if one agreed with the proposed outcomes the bill will seek to achieve, but wants the representative to reconsider the proposed strategy for arriving there. Okay, this is a different question. So I'll answer that next. So advice for an individual looking to ask a representative to reconsider the strategy of their own proposed bill. Okay, so you agree with the outcomes, but you don't love the way it was proposed. This is an issue that I think transcends ideology, right? You'll find no matter what your political ideology or affiliation, if you have one, we all have different ways and means to achieving things. And I will say some legislators are incredibly strategic and they have like a 10-step plan. I know I'm the type of person where I have a menu of options. So if you say no to me, I'm ready. I've got like 6 more ways to do it at least, right? I'm ready to go. Some people will say, it's my way or the highway. This is how we're doing it. If you don't like it, that's fine, but I'm going forward. And so I think it's important to have a menu of negotiating tactics at your disposal to try to convince them. The advice I provided with regard to sitting down with them is really key here. I think you need to educate. If you believe that their proposed pathway causes harm, then it's more important to push on that proposed pathway. But I'll say, I think if your end goal is the same and it's a bill that has a high likelihood of passing the legislature within the next few sessions, sometimes it's just as important to compromise if the end goal is achieved, as long as it doesn't cause harm. And I think the question is, does it cause harm, right? And so I think everyone has a different tolerance for risk, but my advice to anyone when they negotiate, as somebody who spends a lot of time sitting down with people who I may agree with on one thing, but completely disagree with on another, have a menu of options, be willing to compromise, but know where your line is. And what is your outcome? What's the most important? Rank what the outcomes are in terms of importance, priority, and urgency, and negotiate harder for the most urgent, and then go from there. So great question. Are there any other Zoom questions here?
Any other questions in the audience here at all? Okay. Any others in the chat, Nicole? Okay, so we have a few minutes, so we'll just see if anybody else pops into the chat at all. But so far, I think anything. Okay, well, I would like to take the moment here again. I'm going to turn on my camera just so that you can see our faces here. Just thank you again so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time of being part of our seminar series. And with that, I'd just like to again say thank you. And did you have any final thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I actually just have 2 extra slides in case that we had a little bit of extra time. So here we are. I'll go through this real quick. I get asked all the time, how do I participate in government? And as I mentioned, if you want to participate in local government, I think it's pretty easy to attend a local government meeting. It's often much harder to attend a state one. But here are just a few pieces of advice. I think first and foremost, call my office or your other legislator's office to weigh in on an issue. You can ask a question of my staff. You can get information on a bill or issue. You can schedule a meeting. You can always email me, and we do our best to reply to those emails in a quick manner if it's specifically related to a bill you're interested in. You can write a letter. You can attend office hours, which I haven't had during the pandemic just to minimize the risk of so many people meeting at once, but in general, I've had them for 8.5 years and find them to be incredibly valuable in terms of getting ideas and advice from people. And then attending local meetings, I will be there sometimes as well. And so seeing me and mentioning a bill to me or an issue, I have constituents who I'll be like, it's the state parks person, or it's the trout person, or whatever it is. I'll remember them by their issue area. So I want to really encourage you to specialize in an issue if you're going to advocate, because it does help us not only put a face to a name, but then think, okay, they're a professor at UW-SP and this is what they care about, and this is their expertise, and it helps a lot. And then I'm not sure where do I no longer have the ability to go to the next slide? I'm not sure if I do. I think someone else might have that. If somebody could just scroll to the second slide, that would be helpful, because it's not working for me. Yeah, okay. And then social media, obviously, I will say this, it's hard to know who's a constituent and who isn't on social media. So it's always helpful if you identify yourself as one, just because some legislators do get a lot of constituent contacts. I personally get a lot from all over central Wisconsin, and we try to prioritize people in the district first, just because I only have one staff and we have 58,000 constituents, so we need to respond to them as well. There's also budget committee hearings. The Joint Finance Committee travels around the state. They typically do 4 hearings on the budget. The budget is the best time for you to weigh in because it covers so much, whether it covers state park fees, or water quality policy, or agriculture policy, or sporting heritage and wildlife policy. That can sometimes, the funding is policy, right? The budget implementation is policy. So I really want to encourage people to testify at a public listening session if there's one near you, or write to the 16 members of the Joint Finance Committee. I can tell you, as somebody who served on that committee, I have seen people move mountains by showing up to those meetings Sometimes they'll testify as huge groups all wearing the same color shirt, whether it's the AARP or public education advocates, and it makes a big difference. Lawmakers behave better when they know they're being watched. And so when these same people come to every meeting, they feel like they have to listen as legislators and enact whatever it is that they have discussed and asked for. So that's one piece that I think is often missed, is just how monumental the budget is in terms of public policy. It can, just by what it chooses to fund and not fund, that's a policy choice, right? So that can be really helpful. And then testifying at a public hearing, as I mentioned earlier, sharing your personal story, that can really make a difference. I've personally been brought to tears by people who've testified at public hearings on really highly emotional issues like public safety. Passed a bill where, we were all just crying in committee because of it. And so I want you to know that you can make a significant difference, not just in one legislator's view, but in so many. You can affect an entire committee. You can affect a whole legislature. So don't underestimate the power that your voice has. And then I also do like workplace and school visits. And, not only do people come to the Capitol, which I encourage you to do when you have the time and, when we're hopefully further outside of this pandemic, but also those in-person meetings really make a huge difference and remind us why we do what we do and help us keep a finger on the pulse of the community. So just a little more advice. I have all of this on my website as well. So if people have any additional questions, if you want to go back to the questions page, so people just have my email one more time. I think that's probably the best way to follow up. And I appreciate everyone who followed along. Thanks to all the hardworking, I saw a lot of DNR staff at one point who were on. I want to thank them for the work that they do for all of us, and I look forward to future seminars, and especially looking forward to Christine Thomas's. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Probably can't hear it, but there's some applause coming from the audience. So thank you again. And just a reminder, our next seminar is on March 16th, same time here at TNR 170 or on the CNR's YouTube channel with Tony Blattler, Wisconsin Conservation Congress Chair. So thank you. And thank you again, Representative Shankland. You have a great evening.